Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 38 of History for Shut-ins. Today, we will talk about the Appomattox Campaign, Lincoln's second inaugural, his assassination, and the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. The amazing thing about Lincoln's election, and really the 1864 election overall, is that it ever took place. It's taking place during a civil war. This has never happened previously in history. The other amazing thing is that Lincoln gets an overwhelming degree of support from the military and their families. He is the first to come up with the election mantra of not switching horses in midstream. Grant, to help ensure that soldiers are able to vote, allows them to vote by absentee ballot. And if absentee ballots are not accepted in their state, he grants them furloughs so that they are able to go home and vote in person. Because of this, Lincoln is reelected pretty handily, beating McClellan. One of the interesting wrinkles of the 1864 election is that New Jersey tries to outdo itself and does not vote for Lincoln to be reelected, one of the few states. So just another mark in New Jersey's history there. So what I'm going to do is read a portion of Lincoln's second inaugural speech, which is very short but extremely powerful. Quote, "On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish." And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Something that could actually be said today. Lincoln is once again just masterful in his message, talking about slavery being the real cause of the war, although when the war started, it was for Union. Now he mentions the breaking up of the Union as another reason, but truly says slavery is the cause of the war. The Appomattox Campaign. The vice is tightening on Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's repulse at Fort Stedman on March 25th, 1865, coincided with Grant's final offensive. He understood Lee's situation was desperate. Confederate supplies are scarce. Confederate troops were deserting in larger numbers, and Lee's lines were exceedingly thin. On the 31st of March, Union troops attacked and captured Confederate positions along White Oak Road. The Union continued their offensive on April 1st and won a decisive victory at Five Forks. Wasting no time, Grant attacked Lee's main lines in the early hours of April 2nd. Union soldiers broke through the thin Confederate lines. A stubborn and heroic Confederate defense enabled Lee to extricate his army and escape across the Appomattox River. Lee pushed his army west in a bid to secure supplies before trying to link up with Confederate forces in North Carolina. Those are the forces of Joe Johnston that are being chased by William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant pursued Lee aggressively and captures Richmond on the 3rd of April. Constantly harassed by Federal cavalry during the retreat, Lee changed the route of his march several times to avoid forces blocking his path. He managed to avoid disaster until a portion of his army was attacked and defeated at Sailor's Creek on the 6th of April. The Confederate failure to burn High Bridge was extremely crucial. With the Union in hot pursuit of his army, Lee was forced to abandon the food stores waiting for his army at Farmville and push on toward Appomattox Station. Lee could not escape his pursuers and was finally pinned down on April 8th at Appomattox Courthouse. On the morning of April 9th, 9,000 Confederates under Gordon and Fitzhugh Lee deployed in the fields west of the village before dawn. The attack, launched before 8 in the morning and led by General Brian Grimes of North Carolina, was initially successful. The outnumbered Union cavalry fell back, temporarily opening the road to the Confederates. Union infantry began arriving from the west and south, basically encircling Lee. Longstreet's troops were being pressed from the rear near New Hope Church, 3 miles to the east. While Lee realized that the retreat of his army had finally been halted, Grant was riding toward Appomattox Courthouse, where the Union cavalry, followed by infantry from the 5th, 14th, and 25th Corps, blocked the Confederates' path. Lee sent a letter to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss his army's surrender. Grant, who had been suffering from a severe headache, later remembered that upon reading the letter from Lee, his headache all but vanished. He stopped to prepare his reply to Lee, writing that he would push to the front to meet with him. The location of the meeting was left to Lee's discretion. Lieutenant Colonel Orville E. Babcock and his orderly, Captain Dunn, took Grant's reply and rode ahead. Babcock found Lee resting under an apple tree near the Appomattox River. After reading Grant's letter, Lee, his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, and Private Joshua O. Johns, rode toward Appomattox Courthouse, accompanied by federal officers, Lieutenant Colonel Babcock and Captain William McKee Dunn. Marshall and Johns rode ahead of Lee to find a place for Lee and Grant to meet. As Marshall passed through the village, he saw Wilmer McLean in the vicinity of the courthouse. He asked McLean if he knew a suitable location. McLean took him to an empty structure that had no furniture. Marshall immediately said, "This will not do." McLean then offered his own home. Marshall accepted and sent Private Johns back to tell Lee that a meeting site was found. Irony of ironies. At the Battle of First Bull Run, part of the battle was fought on Wilmer McLean's farm in Manassas. What does he do after the battle? He moves west to avoid the war and settles at Appomattox Courthouse. Where does the war end? For all intents and purposes, in his parlor. Wilmer McLean can say, "The war started in my front yard and ended in my parlor." Lee arrived at the McLean house at about 1 in the afternoon. At about 1:30, Grant arrived. Entering the house, Grant greeted Lee in the center of the room. Lee was in a crisp new uniform with his ceremonial sword. He thought he was going to be a prisoner. He wasn't sure what was going to happen. Grant shows up in a mud-spattered field uniform. Grant, who remembered meeting Lee once during the Mexican War, asked Lee if he remembered meeting Grant. Lee said that he did, and they talked for about 25 minutes, very cordially. Finally, Lee says, "Hey, we're here for a very specific purpose," and Grant felt sheepish getting around to it. Grant said that the terms of surrender would be just as he had outlined them in a previous letter to Lee. They were very generous. The terms would parole officers and enlisted men, but required that all Confederate military equipment be relinquished. The discussion drifted to the prospects for peace, but Lee, once again basically taking the lead, asked Grant to put his terms in writing. When Grant finished, he handed the terms to Lee. When Lee finished reading the terms, he said, quote, "This will have a very happy effect on my army," unquote. Lee asked if the terms allowed his men to keep their horses. Lee said, "Hey, they're going to need them because it's harvest season coming up." Grant said that he would not change the terms as written, which had no provisions allowing private soldiers to keep their mounts, but would order his officers to allow any Confederate claiming a horse or a mule to keep it. Grant's generosity goes even further. When Lee mentioned that his men had been without rations for days, Grant arranged for 25,000 rations for the Confederate troops. After formal copies of the surrender terms and Lee's acceptance had been drafted and exchanged, the meeting ended. When Lee leaves, the Union Army starts to cheer. Grant comes out and says, "We cannot do this. These are our countrymen. We have to welcome them back into the fold." On the 10th of April, a second meeting of 6 officers, 3 from the Confederacy and 3 from the Union, convened once again in the McLean parlor. The purpose was to hammer out the details of the formal surrender ceremony and define who was subject to the surrender. In a war marked by bitter fighting, the war ends very simply. Grant's compassion and generosity did much to allay the emotions of the Confederate troops. As for Lee, he realized that the best course was for his men to return home and resume their lives as U.S. citizens. He says to them, if you make as good a citizen as you do a soldier, then our country will be in good shape. Before he met with Grant, one of Lee's officers, General E. Porter Alexander, suggested fighting a guerrilla war, but Lee rejected the idea. It would only cause more pain and suffering for a cause that was lost. The character of both Lee and Grant was of such a high order that the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia has been called the Gentleman's Agreement. Lee ordered or pardon me, Grant, the actual surrender ceremony, who does Grant appoint from the Union to lead the ceremony? None other than Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain accepts the stacked arms of the Confederates at the official ceremony ending the war. Grant's lenient terms were a page out of Lincoln's book. Lincoln is thinking Reconstruction. We can't punish the Confederates. We have to bring them back into the country. They are our countrymen. Of course, with Lincoln's assassination and the control of the radical Republicans in Congress and the effect it has on Andrew Johnson, who takes over once Lincoln is assassinated, the Reconstruction terms change dramatically. As far as the assassination is concerned, John Wilkes Booth, he is a member of one of the nation's most renowned families of acting. His brother Edwin was widely regarded as the country's leading actor, a mantle he had inherited from their father, Junius Brutus Booth. John Wilkes Booth was an acclaimed actor in his own right. He grew up in Maryland, but was popular in Richmond and considered himself a Southerner. He passionately advocated for the slave system. Having promised his mother that he would not fight for the Confederacy, Booth remained in the North during the war. Booth is actually standing behind Lincoln at the second inaugural as Lincoln is giving his second inaugural address. And Grant says afterwards, I had a clear shot. I could have taken him out. His hatred of abolitionists and Lincoln increases, of course, as the war goes on. In March of 1865, he and a group of conspirators in Washington, D.C., initially plot to kidnap Lincoln, and the thought is they will trade him for Confederate prisoners. Of course, the plan doesn't come to fruition. On the morning of April 14th, Booth, who is distraught over the collapse of the Confederacy, learns that Lincoln would be attending a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin that evening at Ford's Theater. Initially, Grant and his wife are to accompany Lincoln and his wife to the theater, but Grant begs off. Gathering his fellow conspirators, Booth outlines a plan to assassinate Lincoln, assassinate the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, William Seward. Booth tasked Lewis Powell, a former Confederate who's very big and powerful, with the attack on Seward, to be aided by David Herold. George Atzerodt, a German immigrant who had acted as a boatman for Confederate spies, was to kill Johnson. All three attacks were to occur at about 10 in the evening. Atzerodt, for lack of a better term, chickens out and never approaches Johnson. Powell invades Seward's home and slashes him with a knife. Seward survives the attack, but his face is permanently disfigured. At Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth made his way to the private box where Lincoln and his wife were watching the play with their guests, Clara Harris and her fiance, Union officer Major Henry Rathbone. Other more prominent people, as I said, like Grant, had declined the invitation. Finding Lincoln's box essentially unguarded, Booth entered and barred the outside door from the inside. Then, at a moment in the play that Booth knew would elicit a big laugh, he bursts in through the box's inner door. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a 44 caliber Derringer. He slashes Rathbone in the back of in the shoulder with a knife and leapt from the box to the stage below, breaking his left leg, in the fall. There is debate on what Booth yelled when he jumped. Some say that he yelled "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, which was Virginia's state motto. Others say that he yelled "The South is avenged." Some say he said both. Once he hits the stage, he disappears through a door at the side of the stage where his horse was being held for him. In a note written a few days after the assassination, Booth claimed that he shouted "sic semper," before he fired. Booth rode off into the night out of the Capitol, meeting in Maryland with Harold, who fled the scene of the Seward attack without Powell. Lincoln was attended to immediately by physicians who were in the audience at Ford's Theater. It was felt that Lincoln should not be moved far, so he was taken across the street to the house of William Peterson. Lincoln was laid diagonally across a bed because he was too big for it. Doctors had little hope that the unconscious Lincoln would recover. Throughout the night, various cabinet members, officials, and physicians kept vigil in the tiny room. Mary Lincoln was grieving hysterically. When Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 in the morning on April 15th, which happened to be Good Friday, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton states, "Now he belongs to the ages." Then throughout the nation on Easter Sunday, sermons in Christian churches equated Lincoln's martyrdom to that of Jesus. A period of national mourning ensued. African Americans felt Lincoln's loss particularly keenly. Historians have noted that Lincoln, whom many even in the North deeply disliked, became much more revered in death than in life as myths surrounding him increased. Think of John F. Kennedy in a similar fashion. After public viewing in both the White House and the Capitol, Lincoln's body in an elaborate open coffin was taken on a 13-day train journey across the country to his home in Springfield, Illinois. The route that he followed, or that the train followed, was the same route that Lincoln followed when he first came to D.C. after being elected in the election of 1860. He stopped here in Philadelphia to lie in state at Independence Hall. He was paraded in a hearse down Fifth Avenue in New York City. One of the witnesses to the parade, sitting in his grandfather's brownstone on Fifth Avenue, a young Teddy Roosevelt. Millions lined the train route to pay their respects. As for the perpetrators, the fleeing John Wilkes Booth had his leg treated by Dr. Samuel Mudd in Maryland. Mudd is later convicted of conspiracy, though his descendants tried to prove his innocence. At the time, this is the largest manhunt in American history. It is fueled by a $100,000 reward. The manhunt fills the countryside surrounding the Capitol with troops and other searchers. Booth and Harold, aided by a Confederate sympathizer, hid for days in a thicket of trees near the Zekia Swamp in Maryland. While hiding, Booth kept a diary, recording his surprise at the almost universal condemnation of his actions. He thought he would be seen as a hero. Booth and Harold were tracked down by federal troops on April 26th at a Virginia farm near the Rappahannock River. Harold surrendered before the barn where he and Booth were hiding was burned. Refusing to surrender, Booth is shot in the neck, either by a soldier, some say he shot himself, and he dies shortly thereafter. 8 of the conspirators were tried by a military commission for Lincoln's murder. Several participated in the plot to kidnap Lincoln, but were less clearly involved in the assassination attempt. Harold, Powell, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, who ran a boarding house in the Capitol frequented by members of the Confederate Underground, were found guilty and hung. Also found guilty, Dr. Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, and Samuel Arnold were sentenced to life in prison. Edmund Spangler received a 6-year sentence. Another conspirator, John Surratt Jr., fled the country but was later captured and stood trial in 1867, though his case was dismissed. Needless to say, the assassination of Lincoln is arguably and ironically the worst thing that could happen to the South. With his death, the more lenient Reconstruction terms that Lincoln was looking to put into place, because his thought is we are welcoming our Southern brothers back into the country. That goes by the wayside. Johnson, who is a Union Democrat from Tennessee, wants to prove his chops and says we need to punish the South. Radical Republicans follow his lead, and Reconstruction terms are heinous. And it may not be a stretch to say it's one reason why we still have issues to this day. We're going to end right there, actually. Quick, short class today, wrapping up the Civil War. We will be back next Wednesday, moving forward with the presidency of Johnson, Reconstruction, and his impeachment. Thank you so much for joining. Look forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them here and I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Take care.